What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Brian Sports Hub. If you're new here, my name is Brian. I am the host of this podcast. And in today's episode, I'm going to turn the clock back a few weeks and look back at the Tuesday, November 5th NFL trade deadline. I'm going to tell you guys some of the biggest winners that came from this year's deadline. I'm excited to talk about it. I've been waiting a little while to do this one. I did the preview, kind of like the predictions for who would land where or who should look at which players, what team should look at which players. I did that last episode. So now this episode, I'm going to give you guys some of the biggest winners. So I'm going to send you the intro, and then I'll meet you guys back to go into the first big winner of this deadline. All right, so starting off my list, I do have a trade that happened about 10 days before the deadline. I still count it because it's within those 2 weeks, but it is the DeAndre Hopkins trade to the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, yes, this did happen, like I said, a week before, but this is one of the biggest, most impactful trades. You take a 32-year-old wide receiver, former All-Pro, former Pro Bowler in DeAndre Hopkins, and you take him from the worst team, arguably in the NFL, and put him on the best back-to-back Super Bowl winning team in the NFL currently, right now, in the Kansas City Chiefs. You upgrade him from Will Levis as his QB to Patrick Mahomes. You add his supporting cast, whoever else DeAndre Hopkins will be with, would be Travis Kelce, Isaiah Pacheco, obviously, like I said, Patrick Mahomes, and you add a slew of other better receivers, better talent around him. This was a win-win by all circumstances. If you go more into the trade, which is why I like it, especially as a win for both sides, is that, like I said, DeAndre is going from one of the worst teams in the NFL in the Titans, with one of the worst quarterbacks right now in the NFL, to one of the best teams with one of the best quarterbacks. This team also is favored right now to win the Super Bowl. So he's going from probably the team most favored to have the first overall pick to the team most favored to win the Super Bowl. Now, on Kansas City's side, as a team that's looking to try and contend, looking for that three-peat that's never been done before in NFL history, they're trying to find someone that can immediately impact, doesn't matter age, doesn't matter how long, doesn't matter contract, just who can come in and help us win. And DeAndre Hopkins answers all of those boxes, checks off every single one of those boxes. Like I said, he's a 32-year-old, he's kind of at the end of his prime, so he's still in his prime. A wide receiver's prime tends to last roughly between 27 and like 31 to 32 years. He's coming up on the end of it, but he's still a former All-Pro, former Pro Bowler. Now, if you go into the trade details, the Kansas City Chiefs acquired DeAndre Hopkins by just trading one pick. It was a 2025 fifth-round pick to the Titans. That's it. And be honest, that's insane. There is no way that there was nothing for me to think that DeAndre Hopkins would go for anything less than a fourth-round pick. I expected at least a third, just because he's still talented. Granted, the numbers aren't there if you go look on ESPN, and especially before this trade, because like I said, this is now about a month ago. So before this trade, his numbers were putrid. It was not very good. It was not really what we're used to seeing out of DeAndre Hopkins. But he did just come off of a 1,000-yard receiving year with the Titans, with a QB carousel in Tennessee. Now you take that former All-Pro, you take that top-tier wide receiver, at least at one point was top tier and arguably still is, and you now put him and rejuvenate him into a young Kansas City offense with Patrick Mahomes, arguably the best QB of this generation. It is going to be a fun sight to see. It's already been fun to watch, and it has elevated the Chiefs game so much. It has elevated their offense. Patrick Mahomes has looked semi-better. It has not been his best season by far, but he is looking better with DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins is starting to get comfortable in these last few weeks. And it is very, very sure, I am very sure that this is, if not, it's at least one, if not the biggest winner of this trade deadline, was acquiring DeAndre Hopkins. Now, moving on to another receiver. This one happened on the deadline. There were like 6 or 7 trades. It was a lot of trades that happened in the deadline. Very hard to keep track of. 3 of them will be in this list. And this next one was one of the top trade names to go around. It was Mike Williams. Mike Williams is a 28-year-old experienced wide receiver veteran, and he was with the Jets. He was signed in free agency, 1-year deal. He was expected to be the second wide receiver, at worst third, behind Garrett Wilson. For whatever reason or circumstances happened, whether it was injuries, whether it was connection with the staff, whether it was learning the playbook, he ended up dropping to about the fourth and fifth wide receiver on the team, on the roster, behind the likes of Garrett Wilson, Alan Lazard, and then once they traded for Devontae Adams, he even moved farther down. Obviously, the time was up. It was either sit the rest of the year and just have him on their bench. This is the Jets organization thinking. Either sit him on the bench or let him play maybe 3 snaps, a game or whatever it is, a very small fraction of snaps, and just let him walk in free agency or try and get something out of him. So they asked around, they looked, and they found a suitable team in the Pittsburgh Steelers who have been looking for another experienced wide receiver veteran to be either their wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3. So the Steelers decided, let's go. We're going to make this trade. They agreed on trading. The Jets and Steelers agreed on trading Mike Williams to the Steelers for just one 2025 fifth-round pick. Pretty much the exact same trade that DeAndre Hopkins had. And to me, once again, this is shocking. With all the wide receivers available, you had Mike Williams, you had DeAndre Hopkins. Apparently Jonathan Mingo was available, but that was a whole different spectrum. You had Deontay Johnson. I expected most of these guys to go for probably fourth. Maybe some were fifth, like a Mike Williams, but you would expect at least another pick with that, maybe a fifth and a seventh, fifth and a sixth. But no, apparently these teams are very satisfied with just giving up these top talented wide receivers or players for just one middle round pick. Well, it worked out in both favor. The Jets got rid of a player that they probably weren't going to get anything for, so you can see that as a win. They can take that as a win. But I think out of this, the Steelers are the bigger winner. They get this experienced 28-year-old wide receiver, like I've been saying, to step in and help with that offense. Russell Wilson just stepped in. He's now 4-0 playing. And Mike Williams, actually on the week after he got traded, scored the game-winning touchdown. He is shown to be very important and an integral part into the Steelers offense. And it really opened up their passing game. And I love it. As a Ravens fan, I don't. But as an objective NFL fan, I absolutely love this trade. And there's no reason not to believe the Steelers are one of the big winners. They also made a trade earlier for Preston Smith. So they had some good moves. This one was obviously the bigger one of the two, but I really love what they did here. And it's really going to help them contend with that top tier defense. Now the offense is catching up and it's just going to expand. And I think they will make a decent run into the playoffs. The AFC is top heavy, so I don't know how far they can make it, but I could see them winning 1, maybe 2 games in the playoffs and then taking this roster next year and hopefully getting another 1, 2, maybe even 3 games won in the playoffs next year. So moving on to my next player in the list, it's Cam Robinson. This is an offensive lineman. This was this was about a week before the trade deadline. It was October 30th. And honestly, I must have been lacking because I was not watching the news until all of a sudden I get this ESPN come up, right? I'm not looking at anything for Vikings. ESPN pops up and it says Cam Robinson traded. I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's traded. But now looking back on it, it kind of makes sense. Cam Robinson in the last few years has been in talks with contracts. There's been controversy over whether he wants to get extended, whether they would extend him. He wanted money. Jaguars didn't want to pay him. All this. Either way, it turns out this year, Jaguars decided to say, we're not doing well. It doesn't look like we're going to make it to the playoffs. Why don't we trade this left tackle, Cam Robinson, 29-year-old, to a team and hopefully get something in return? Well, they did trade him, but I wouldn't really say they got much in return. If you look at the details, the Vikings traded away a 2026 and a 2026 conditional 7th round pick. That was all for Cam Robinson and another 2026 conditional 7th round pick. Now, conditional pick just means that there are certain conditions that can elevate that pick to maybe a 6th round. Usually it's only 1 round that it jumps. So let's say the Jaguars or like the Vikings end up going to the playoffs. If this was the condition, that 7th round pick would jump up to a 6th. Those are like what conditional round picks are, and you'll see more in a little bit. But that's all they traded. They traded 1 conditional 7th round pick 2 years from now for Cam Robinson and another conditional 7th round pick. If I had to learn anything from this, it was that the Jaguars were just wanting to get rid of Cam Robinson and most likely just get rid of that contract that he signed a few years ago, just so they can restart with this young core of Trevor Lawrence, Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, Brian Thomas Jr., and just try and rebuild and restart next year and just look forward to next season. Now, as far as the winner, why they're a winner, the Vikings a few weeks ago or I guess now it's about a month and a half ago, lost their starting left tackle, one of the best left tackles in the game, in Christian Darrisaw. Very young, very good tackle. Ended up going out with a torn ACL, torn MCL, freak accident, someone rolled up on his leg, ended up being out for the season. This is a Vikings team that is contending with Sam Darnold, with Justin Jefferson, with Jordan Addison. They're contending to make a run in the playoffs, and they need a left tackle in order to protect Sam Darnold's blind side. There was no better option, and honestly, this trade even looks better to then go out and grab a left tackle in Cam Robinson. One of the best, in my opinion, pickups, one of the most underrated pickups in this whole trade deadline. The Vikings fill a need, and then on top of that, if they were to come back next year, Christian Darrisaw makes his return, they can try and switch Cam Robinson from the left to the right side. Now, it is a big jump to try and switch sides and tackles, but you can try and switch him over there, and then you're now going to have two of the top tackles in the games, or at least two top 15, top 16 tackles, blocking both sides of your quarterback, with J.J. McCarthy coming back from injury as well. So this was a beautiful trade. It was one of my favorites, one of the most underrated ones once I found out it was actually happening, between the Vikings and Cam Robinson. So like I said, the Vikings, they improve, they get that filler for left tackle, and as for Cam Robinson, he gets a fresh start. He gets with a new team, and now he's going from, very much like many of these other people or players, he's going from a very bad team to one of the contending teams, one of the top contending teams in the NFC. So, moving on to the next player. It's one that I actually predicted, very similar to the Mike Williams trade. Zadarius Smith to the Detroit Lions. Now, this happened on trade deadline. This is one of the picks that happened on trade deadline. Zadarius Smith traded. He's a 32-year-old former All-Pro, former Pro Bowler. He was looked at by a bunch of teams, and the Browns ended up settling with the Detroit Lions. And for a former Pro Bowler, for a former All-Pro, who is still pretty good right now, he's still playing well. Only getting traded for 2 mid-round picks, and I'll go more into detail in a little bit, is really quite shocking to me. I don't know how a Browns team, unless they just wanted to get off his contract, would trade him away. He's very good. I get that you're doing bad. But at that point, I guess it was just like, let's clear house. We already have Deshaun Watson's contract we got to pay. Why don't we just get rid of someone we can get rid of, like Zadarius Smith, rather than trying to work around this contract and rebuild a team that obviously hasn't been rebuilt since 2020 when Baker Mayfield took them to the playoffs. So the Detroit Lions traded away to the Browns a 2025 fifth-round pick and a 2026 sixth-round pick to Cleveland for Zadarius Smith and a 2026 seventh-round pick. Very small risk, high reward, and it fills a need that the Lions are desperately striving for. They need a pass rusher after Aiden Hutchinson broke his leg really early in this season. Ended up snapping his leg. Not the greatest, very gruesome injury. He's now better in rehab. There's reports that he might even be ready for the Super Bowl. But in order to get to the Super Bowl, you got to have a pass rush and you got to win. And one of the things the Lions lacked, especially after Aiden Hutchinson's injury, was a pass. It's called the pass rush win rate. It's basically the percentage that the team or the pass rushers beat their linemen, beat their assignments, and get to the quarterback. The Lions, out of 32 teams, after Aiden Hutchinson got injured, ranked 26th. They were not good. Adding this to Zadarius Smith, making this trade for a low risk, high reward, not giving up 4th, 3rd, 2nd round picks for still a top tier edge rusher, was a complete win. So the Lions get this fill. They fill this need. They replace Hutchinson for now. And then possibly next year, now you have a pair of Aiden Hutchinson and Zadarius Smith rushing the quarterback, which will probably be one of the top tier duos in the NFL. And as for Zadarius Smith, he gets to go to a contending team in a weaker conference in the NFC. It's weaker than the AFC. So he has a better shot at winning the Super Bowl. And on top of that, he gets a fresh start. Now he's going to sit there on a Lions team. He's going to enjoy football because he's not so worried about, and it's not just the Cleveland Browns, but not so worried about trying to win to save a job or save a coach's job. He's in a comfortable, secure place now where he can just love football and just go out and focus on getting the quarterback. So this is absolutely one of the better trades. This is why it's a win for me. Zadarius Smith gets a new start. The Lions get to fill a need and still have a very, very strong chance of winning the Super Bowl, and at that, even going to the Super Bowl. The last big winner on my list is the Washington Commanders, who traded for Marshawn Lattimore just hours before the trade deadline ended at 4 p.m. on November 5th. They ended up getting a few picks. They traded 3 picks, a 3rd, 4th, and 6th round pick in the next draft, the 2025 draft, to the Saints for Marshawn Lattimore and a 2025 5th round pick. This is a huge win for the Commanders. They have been looking for defensive help. They have a contending team that is fighting for the NFC East Division title with the Philadelphia Eagles, and this is absolutely one that moves the marker for them. Their offense has been great, led by Jaden Daniels with the new offensive coordinator in Cliff Kingsbury. They have been doing great. Dan Quinn has been doing great with that head coaching job, but the defense has been lacking. They haven't lived up to the hype, or not really the hype, but to the same level of play as the offense has. So the Commanders went out, they started hunting, and I actually predicted in one of my other ones, or at least mentioned in my last episode, that the Commanders should go after Marshawn Lattimore. They should be a team to watch for Marshawn Lattimore. And they did end up trading him. Like I said, they traded for 3 picks next year's draft for Marshawn and another pick. And in Marshawn, they're getting a 28-year-old former All-Pro, former Pro Bowler, who just has sadly been hit by the injury bug these last few years. That's the main reason why he's traded. The Saints have not been good this year, and he's a fan favorite in New Orleans because he's been there for so long. But when injuries start to occur and a team starts doing bad, they look to trade you. They look to get off your contract. Marshawn's on one of the heavier contracts as far as quarterbacks go, and they were looking to try and trade him any way possible to at least get out from under the contract and get a few assets in return without letting him walk in the next wave of free agency whenever he is released. Now, as for the Commanders, they had a top cornerback. There was a first-round pick a few years ago named Emmanuel Forbes. Sadly, he just hasn't been performing as a first-round pick should be. He's been in 2 years now. I believe this is his 2nd year. And he's just not performing as well as a first-rounder should. And now they have this rookie, Mike Sanistro, who's actually been really good. You could argue he's been one of the better, if not the best cornerback they've had. And you have St. Juice. They have not been performing as well as the offense, and for that reason, they looked. For me, Marshawn Lattimore gets a new start in the Commanders. He gets to come to a contending team that has hopes of making a deep playoff run. He gets to reset. He gets to heal. There's no pressure of him coming back like the Saints. He had pressure in the Saints because they were losing. He has no pressure in Washington. There's absolutely no pressure on him coming back, rushing his recovery time back from an injury. On top of that, the Commanders get like I said, all-pro level cornerback, an all-pro level player. It is rare to find them, but for some reason this this trade deadline, everyone's just throwing all these these veteran, more experienced, older all-pros everywhere for cheap. Don't understand it, but that's what it was this deadline. And Marshawn Lattimore was probably the biggest of those all-pros to be traded. Now, there were some other teams that were looking at him. I think it was like the Ravens. The Chiefs were in talks about him, but the Commanders were ultimately able to land him. And I think for that reason, and for the place he's landing, for the team he's landing with, and for the biggest need the Commanders had was being a cornerback, those reasons combined make this one of the best trades and one of the best wins of the deadline. So recapping my 5 biggest winners, you have the DeAndre Hopkins to the Kansas City Chiefs trade, you have the Mike Williams to the Pittsburgh Steelers trade, and you have the Cam Robinson to the Minnesota Vikings trade, the Zadarius Smith to the Detroit Lions trade, and the Marshawn Lattimore to the Washington Commanders trade. Those were my 5 biggest winners. There were a lot of other teams that won that made some underrated moves, but these 5 stood out the most and probably made the best moves and the most impactful moves for their season. Now, the season still has quite a lot of time left, and nothing is really set in stone. No team has secured their spot in the playoffs, and I believe no team yet has been dropped from the playoffs. So the race is getting tight. The weeks are getting shorter. There are less weeks to be playing. It's going to be fun. So make sure you tune in to the NFL season. Tune back in here to Brian's Sports Hub as I will be going through talking about more, whether it's predictions, whether it's who's going to make it to the playoffs, who should be winning the division. All types of information, all types of content will be covered here as this NFL season progresses into the second half. But that's all for me today in this episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And remember, this is Brian Sports Hub, your source for sports.